Good evening and get comfortable. Tonight, we're traveling to the farmlands of southwestern Minnesota, to a spring night in 2008 when a 19-year-old college student vanished into thin air during a phone call with his father. This is one of those cases that defies easy explanation. A disappearance so mysterious that even after more than 16 years, nobody can say with certainty what happened to Brandon Swanson. There's something particularly haunting about this case. Brandon didn't disappear in a dangerous city or a crime-ridden neighborhood. He vanished from rural Minnesota farmland, open fields where you can see for miles in every direction. He was on the phone with his parents the entire time, trying to find his way home. And then, in a single moment, he was gone. No body has ever been found. No evidence has ever surfaced. Just a car in a ditch, confused parents searching through the darkness, and a young man's voice saying, "Oh, shit," before falling silent forever. So tonight, I'm going to walk you through every detail of this case. We'll explore Brandon's life, that final night, the extensive searches, the theories about what might have happened, and the legacy he left behind. A law that changed how police respond to missing persons cases across Minnesota. Let's begin at the beginning, with a young man who had his whole future ahead of him. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989, in Marshall, Minnesota, to parents Brian and Annette Swanson. Marshall is a small city in Lyon County, in the southwestern corner of Minnesota, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where Friday night football games are major events, and where the landscape is dominated by endless fields of corn and soybeans. Brandon grew up in a close-knit family. He had a younger sister named Jamine, and by all accounts, he was a loving older brother. The Swansons were the kind of family who had dinner together, who talked about their days, who stayed connected. This detail becomes important later, because when Brandon went missing, his parents knew immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't a kid who would just disappear without telling anyone. Brandon was described by everyone who knew him as friendly, intelligent, and outgoing. He had a natural curiosity about the world, particularly when it came to science and technology. He was the kind of student who asked questions in class not to show off, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how things worked. In 2007, Brandon graduated from Marshall High School. Now, at this point in many young people's lives, there's pressure to leave town, go to a big university, start a completely new chapter. But Brandon made a different choice, one that showed both his practicality and his connection to his family. He decided to stay in Marshall and attend Minnesota West Community and Technical College, just a short drive away in Canby. But he wasn't just taking random classes or figuring things out. Brandon had a specific goal. He enrolled in a certificate program for renewable energy and wind turbines. Think about that for a moment. In 2007, renewable energy wasn't the massive industry it is today. Brandon was thinking ahead, preparing for a field that would only become more important as time went on. He was planning for a career that would matter, that would contribute something meaningful to the world. And it wasn't just about staying local forever. Brandon had plans to transfer to Iowa Western College, more than 250 miles away, for the fall 2008 semester. This would be his first time really living on his own, away from his family, starting that independent adult life. He was excited about it, looking forward to the opportunities, the new experiences, the chance to grow. Brandon was a young man of average height, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and slim build, weighing around 120 pounds. He had brown hair and brown eyes. He wore black wire-framed glasses, which he needed because he was legally blind in his left eye, a detail that becomes significant when we consider him walking through dark farmland at night. He had a few distinguishing features. A small scar above his left eye, pierced ears where he typically wore one stud earring in each ear. He often wore a heavy sterling silver necklace. These are the kinds of details that matter when someone goes missing, small markers that might help someone identify them. The spring semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College ended on May 13, 2008. For Brandon, this was a milestone. He'd completed his certificate program in wind turbines. He was officially done with this chapter of his education and ready to move forward to the next one. Like college students everywhere, Brandon and his classmates wanted to celebrate. They'd worked hard all semester, they'd finished their exams, and now it was time to relax and enjoy the accomplishment. Brandon's celebration plans were relatively modest. He wasn't planning some wild weekend in a big city. He was going to attend a couple of small parties with friends, the kind of low-key gatherings that happen in small-town America every weekend. Some drinks, some laughs, some music, hanging out with people he'd spent the past year studying alongside. That afternoon and evening, Brandon attended gatherings in two different towns, one in Lind and another in Canby. According to his friends who were there, Brandon did have some alcoholic beverages, but nobody thought he was drunk. He wasn't stumbling around or slurring his words. He was just enjoying himself, celebrating with friends, being a normal 19-year-old on the last night of the semester. Nobody who saw Brandon that night had any idea it would be the last time they'd ever see him. There were no goodbyes, no final words, no sense of foreboding. Just a regular night that ended with Brandon deciding it was time to head home. It was shortly after midnight on May 14th when Brandon left the party in Canby and got into his car to drive home to Marshall. The drive should have been simple, about 30 minutes on Highway 68, a straight shot that Brandon had driven many times before. But for reasons that have never been fully explained, Brandon decided not to take Highway 68 that night. Instead, he chose to drive the back roads, the rural gravel roads that wind through farmland, connecting small towns and farmhouses. Why did he make this choice? Nobody knows for certain. Some have speculated that he wanted to avoid any possibility of encountering police on the main highway. He'd been drinking, after all, even if his friends didn't think he was intoxicated. Maybe he thought the back roads were safer in that regard. Others have suggested he might have simply wanted to take a scenic route, enjoy the quiet of the countryside, take his time getting home. Or maybe he was just trying a different way, exploring roads he hadn't driven before. Whatever his reasoning, it was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. At some point during his drive, somewhere along those dark rural roads, Brandon's car went into a ditch. We don't know exactly what happened. Did he misjudge a turn? Was he distracted for a moment? Did he swerve to avoid an animal? The roads in this area are narrow with soft shoulders, and at night in rural Minnesota, they can be pitch black. No streetlights, just your headlights cutting through the darkness. The good news was that Brandon wasn't hurt. The car had what he described as high-centered, meaning the undercarriage was resting on the raised center of the road or ditch, with the wheels suspended above the ground. The car wasn't damaged. He wasn't injured. He was just stuck. Brandon got out of the car and assessed the situation. He couldn't drive out on his own. The wheels just spun uselessly. He needed help. So he did what anyone would do in 2008. He pulled out his cell phone and called his parents. The time was approximately 1:54 a.m. when Brandon's call connected to his parents' phone. Brian and Annette Swanson were asleep when the phone rang, that heart-stopping middle-of-the-night ring that every parent dreads. But when they answered, Brandon's voice was calm. He wasn't panicking. He explained the situation clearly. He'd driven into a ditch, the car was stuck, he was fine, but he needed them to come pick him up so he could deal with getting the car out in the morning. Brian and Annette, being the parents they were, didn't hesitate. They got dressed, got into their pickup truck, and started driving out to get their son. They kept Brandon on the phone as they drove, both to keep him company and to try to figure out exactly where he was. And this is where things started to get confusing. Brandon told his parents he believed he was near Lind, a small town just northwest of Marshall, about 7 miles from their home. He'd been at a party in Lind earlier that evening, so it made sense to him that he'd be near there. He told his parents to head toward Lind, and he'd try to guide them to his exact location. To help them find him, Brandon got back in his car and started flashing his headlights on and off, a beacon in the darkness that his parents should be able to see from a distance in the flat, open farmland. Brian and Annette drove to the area near Lind where Brandon said he was. They flashed their own headlights. They called out to him. Brandon, on the other end of the phone, was doing the same thing, flashing his lights, looking for his parents' truck. But they couldn't find each other. Neither Brandon nor his parents could see each other's lights. They couldn't hear each other calling. It was as if they were in completely different places, which, as it would turn out, they were. After about 20 minutes of failed attempts to locate each other, both Brandon and his parents were getting frustrated. This should have been simple. In flat farmland with good visibility, if they were anywhere near each other, they should be able to see the lights. Brandon made a decision. He told his parents he could see some lights in the distance that he believed were from the town of Lind. He would leave his car and walk toward those lights. Once he got to town, they could meet at a specific location, the parking lot of a local bar that they all knew. Annette had to be at work early that morning, so Brian dropped her off at home and headed back out to try to find Brandon. He drove toward the bar in Lind where they'd agreed to meet, keeping his son on the phone the entire time. Brandon started walking. This is where we need to pause and really picture the scene. It's sometime between 2 o'clock and 2:30 in the morning. Brandon is walking through rural Minnesota farmland in mid-May. The fields are likely muddy from spring rains. The ground is uneven. There are ditches, fences, crop fields. And remember, Brandon is legally blind in one eye, and he's left his glasses in the car. His depth perception and night vision are compromised. But he's 19 years old, he's trying to get home, and he thinks he's close to town. So he walks, talking to his father the whole way, describing what he's seeing, trying to figure out where he is. For 47 minutes, Brandon and Brian stayed on the phone together. Father and son, talking through the night, both frustrated, both trying to solve this puzzle of where exactly Brandon was. Brandon walked through fields. He told his father he was walking through what seemed like farmland, that he was climbing through fences, that he was making progress toward the lights he could see. And then, at approximately 2:30 a.m., 47 minutes into the call, something happened. Brandon suddenly interrupted himself in the middle of speaking, and he said just 2 words, "Oh, shit," and then, silence. The phone didn't disconnect. The line was still open, but Brandon wasn't saying anything. Brian called out to him. "Brandon? Brandon, what happened? Are you there?" Nothing. Just silence. Brian kept trying. He called Brandon's name over and over. He waited, hoping his son was just catching his breath, or had tripped and would pick up the phone in a moment. But minutes passed, and there was still no response. Finally, Brian hung up and immediately tried calling back. The phone rang, but Brandon didn't answer. Brian called again, and again, and again. No answer. It was as if Brandon Swanson had simply vanished in mid-sentence. As dawn broke on May 14, 2008, Brian and Annette Swanson were frantic. They hadn't heard from Brandon since that terrible moment when he said, "Oh, shit," and went silent. They'd tried calling him repeatedly. They'd driven around the area near Lind, searching for any sign of him or his car. Nothing. At 6:30 a.m., they called the local police to report their son missing. And this is where the story takes a frustrating turn that would eventually lead to major legislative changes in Minnesota. When the Swansons reported Brandon missing, the police response was dismissive. The officers taking the report pointed out that Brandon was 19 years old, an adult. They told his parents that it wasn't unusual for young men his age to stay out all night, to maybe crash at a friend's house without calling home. One officer reportedly told them, "It's his right to be missing." Think about how those words must have felt to Annette and Brian. Their son had been on the phone with them, had said something was wrong, had gone silent mid-sentence, and wasn't answering his phone. And they were being told that this was normal behavior, that they just needed to wait for him to show up. But the Swansons knew their son. This wasn't normal behavior for Brandon. He wasn't the type to just disappear without letting them know where he was. Something was wrong. They knew it in their bones. The police did say they would look into it, but there was no sense of urgency. No immediate search was launched. They took down the information and told the Swansons to wait. So the Swansons waited, but not passively. They continued driving around, searching, calling Brandon's friends, trying to figure out what could have happened. Later that day, law enforcement finally obtained Brandon's cell phone records. And when they analyzed which cell tower his phone had been pinging, they made a startling discovery. Brandon hadn't been near Lind at all. His phone records showed that his last calls had been routed through a cell tower near Porter, Minnesota, approximately 25 miles from Lind, 25 miles from where he thought he was, 25 miles from where his parents had been searching. This was a huge revelation, but it also raised enormous questions. How could Brandon have been so far off in his estimation of where he was? The towns of Lind and Porter are in completely different directions from Canby. How did he end up so disoriented? But at least now they knew where to search. Armed with the cell phone data placing Brandon near Porter, law enforcement redirected their search efforts to that area. They focused on the rural roads around Porter and the nearby town of Taunton. And there, in a ditch near the Lincoln County line, they found Brandon's car. The Chevrolet Lumina was exactly as Brandon had described, high-centered in the ditch, the undercarriage resting on elevated ground with the wheels unable to get traction. The car wasn't damaged. There were no signs of a collision or mechanical failure. When officers examined the car, they found Brandon's glasses on the front seat. Remember, he was legally blind in one eye. No keys in the ignition or anywhere in or around the car. No signs of foul play. No blood. No struggle. Nothing to indicate violence. The location was important. The car was found approximately 1 mile from Highway 68, that main road Brandon could have taken home but chose not to. It was in farmland, surrounded by fields, near the Yellow Medicine River. But there was no sign of Brandon himself. Once Brandon's car was located, a proper search operation began. This wasn't just local police anymore. Multiple agencies got involved, including the Lyon County Sheriff's Department, Lincoln County authorities, and the Minnesota State Patrol. They brought in search dogs, trained canines that could follow Brandon's scent and potentially lead them to where he had gone. The dogs immediately picked up Brandon's scent at the car. They followed it away from the vehicle, tracking through a field. The trail led the dogs toward the Yellow Medicine River, which runs through that area. And this is where things got both interesting and troubling. The dogs tracked Brandon's scent to the riverbank. According to the handlers, the scent trail then crossed the river and continued on the other side. The dogs followed it a bit further and then the trail ended, abruptly, as if Brandon had simply stopped existing at that point. The Yellow Medicine River became the focus of the search. At the time Brandon disappeared in mid-May, the river was running high and fast due to spring snowmelt and rains. Parts of the river were knee-deep, but other sections were much deeper, up to 15 feet in some spots. The theory that quickly developed was that Brandon had accidentally fallen into the river and drowned. It would explain the abrupt end to the phone call, "Oh, shit!" Could have been him realizing he was falling, the sudden silence, and why the scent trail ended at the river. Divers searched the river. Boats with sonar equipment scanned the depths. Searchers walked the banks, looking for any sign of clothing, personal effects, or a body. They found nothing. No body surfaced. No clothing was snagged on branches or rocks. No wallet, no phone, no keys, nothing. The searches continued for days, then weeks. Volunteers from the community joined professional search teams. They covered miles of riverbank, fields, drainage ditches, everywhere Brandon might have gone. Still nothing. Lyon County Sheriff Eric Weizsäcker became personally invested in finding Brandon. For 30 days straight, Sheriff Weizsäcker walked the 2-mile section of the Yellow Medicine River where the dogs had tracked Brandon's scent. Every single day for a month, he walked that riverbank, looking for any clue, any sign of what had happened to the young man. But the river kept its secrets. As the weeks turned into months with no developments, most of the official search efforts were scaled back and eventually discontinued. There were other cases to work, other demands on limited resources. Without any new leads or evidence, there was only so much law enforcement could do. But for the Swanson family, the search never stopped. After the initial intensive search efforts in May and June of 2008 yielded nothing, the Swanson family and dedicated volunteers developed a pattern of seasonal searches that would continue for years. The challenge they faced was the landscape itself. This part of Minnesota is agricultural land, fields that are planted in the spring, grow through the summer, and are harvested in the fall. When Brandon disappeared in mid-May, the fields were just being planted. Within weeks, corn and soybean plants began growing, eventually reaching heights that made searching difficult or impossible. So the search strategy adapted to the agricultural calendar. In late fall, after the harvest, when the fields were clear again, search teams would return. They'd walk through the harvested fields with renewed hope, looking for anything that might have been hidden by the summer crops. Dogs would be brought back out to see if they could pick up any scents now that the vegetation had been removed. Then winter would come, with its snow and freezing temperatures, making searches impractical. In the spring, before planting began again, there would be another window. A few weeks when the ground was visible but not yet planted. Search teams would take advantage of this time, covering ground that had been inaccessible for months. This cycle continued year after year. Spring searches, fall searches, hundreds of volunteers walking through fields, scanning the ground, hoping to find some trace of Brandon Swanson. The porch light. The Swanson family developed their own ritual of hope. Every night, every single night, they left their porch light on. It was a beacon, a signal to Brandon that if he was out there somewhere, if he was lost or confused or hurt, he could find his way home. The light would guide him. They continued this practice for at least 5 years. Night after night, that porch light burned. Neighbors would see it. People driving past would know what it meant. It became a symbol of a family's unwavering hope and unbreakable love. Imagine the weight of that ritual. Every night, turning on that light. Every morning, waking up to find Brandon still gone. Every day, the absence. Every night, the hope. Month after month. Year after year. Expanding the search area. As the searches continued, the focus area gradually expanded. Initially, everything had centered on the Yellow Medicine River and the immediate vicinity of where Brandon's car was found. But as months passed with no findings, searchers began looking further afield. One area that became of particular interest was northwest of Porter. Search dogs repeatedly showed interest in this area, giving alerts that suggested human remains might be present. But despite intensive searching, including ground-penetrating radar and other advanced techniques, nothing was found. Mud Creek, another body of water in the area, also became a search focus. Like the Yellow Medicine River, it was thoroughly searched by divers and sonar equipment. Again, nothing. By 2011, 3 years after Brandon's disappearance, approximately 122 square miles had been searched. That's an enormous area, and yet there was no sign of Brandon Swanson anywhere within it. One significant obstacle to the search efforts was landowner permission. Much of the area where Brandon disappeared is private farmland. Search teams needed permission from landowners to access their property. Most landowners were cooperative, understanding the urgency of trying to find a missing person. But some were reluctant or refused, particularly cattle farmers who were concerned about search dogs disturbing their livestock or potentially spreading diseases. Ken Anderson of Emergency Support Services, a professional search organization that took over much of the search effort in late 2008, has been particularly vocal about this challenge. There are still portions of land in the search area, land where dogs have shown interest, that Emergency Support Services has never been allowed to access. Could Brandon's remains be on one of these inaccessible properties? It's impossible to know, but it's a frustrating reality that even with all the volunteers, all the professional searchers, all the technology, some areas simply couldn't be thoroughly searched. The cell phone mystery. One piece of evidence that complicated the search was Brandon's cell phone activity. According to Sheriff Fizeki, Brandon's phone remained turned on and receiving signal until May 16th, 2 days after his disappearance. This fact has fueled speculation and theories. If Brandon had fallen into the river and drowned on the night of May 14th, would his phone have remained functional and on for 2 more days? It seems unlikely, though not impossible if the phone wasn't fully submerged or was protected somehow. The fact that the phone stayed on suggests that maybe, just maybe, Brandon was still alive somewhere during those 2 days. But if so, why didn't he call for help? Why didn't he answer when his parents called repeatedly? One possibility is that the phone was damaged in some way. Maybe the screen was broken or the speaker didn't work, so Brandon couldn't use it even though it was still technically on and connected to the cell network. Another possibility is that the phone was separated from Brandon somehow and continued operating without him. Or perhaps it means something more sinister, that someone else had Brandon's phone for those 2 days. These are the kinds of questions that keep investigators, family members, and true crime enthusiasts awake at night. Questions without answers. Taking over the case. In 2010, recognizing the complexity and importance of the case, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, BCA, took over as the lead agency. The BCA has more resources, more specialized investigators, and the ability to coordinate across multiple jurisdictions more effectively than smaller local agencies. The BCA reviewed everything that had been done up to that point. They looked at all the evidence, all the search data, all the witness statements. They brought fresh eyes to the case. And they continued the search, though with a more measured, strategic approach. Rather than massive volunteer searches every season, the BCA focused on following up specific leads, using advanced technology, and carefully analyzing any new information that came in. But even with the BCA's expertise and resources, the case remained unsolved. In the midst of their grief and frustration, Annette and Brian Swanson made a remarkable decision. They chose to channel their pain into something constructive, something that could help other families avoid the delays and dismissiveness they had experienced when they first tried to report Brandon missing. They decided to work for legislative change. The problem was clear. When Brandon went missing, law enforcement had initially refused to take the case seriously because he was an adult. There was an assumption that adults who go missing have chosen to do so, that they have a right to be missing, and that police should wait to see if they show up on their own before dedicating resources to searching for them. This assumption might make sense in some cases. Adults who are unhappy at home, who want to start fresh somewhere, who deliberately leave without telling anyone. But it makes no sense in cases like Brandon's, where there's clear evidence that something is wrong. Brandon had been in the middle of a phone call with his father. He'd expressed distress. He'd gone silent suddenly. He wasn't answering his phone. These weren't the actions of someone who had chosen to disappear. They were warning signs that something bad had happened. The Swansons wanted to change the law so that no other family would lose precious hours, the most critical hours, waiting for police to take their missing person report seriously. Working with legislators. The Swansons partnered with State Representative Marty Seifert, who represented Marshall in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Seifert was moved by their story and committed to helping them create meaningful change. Together, they worked on drafting legislation that would address the gaps in Minnesota's missing persons laws. The bill they developed, which came to be known as Brandon's Law, had several key provisions. Law enforcement agencies would be required to accept missing persons reports without delay. Immediately, as soon as someone reports a person missing, police could no longer refuse to take a report based on assumptions that the person wasn't really missing, or that they'd chosen to disappear, or that they'd likely show up on their own. Once a report was taken, law enforcement would be required to make a preliminary determination about whether the missing person was potentially in dangerous circumstances. If the person was determined to be endangered, police would be required to begin an immediate investigation and search. The agency taking the initial report would be designated as the lead agency, eliminating confusion about jurisdiction, which had been a problem in Brandon's case, where his car was found on a county line with multiple agencies claiming or disclaiming responsibility. Law enforcement agencies would be required to promptly notify other nearby agencies about the missing person. The bill essentially changed the focus from Missing Children's Act to Missing Persons Act, recognizing that adults can also be genuinely missing and in danger, not just choosing to be absent. Building support. Getting the bill through the legislature wasn't automatic. Seifert recalled that there was initial resistance from some in the law enforcement community. There were concerns about privacy issues, particularly regarding when police could track someone's cell phone. There were worries about being overwhelmed with missing persons reports that turned out to be voluntary absences. But the Swansons worked tirelessly to build support. They told Brandon's story to anyone who would listen. They met with sheriffs, police chiefs, advocacy groups. They testified before committees. They made the case that this wasn't about forcing police to chase after every teenager who stayed out past curfew. It was about ensuring that when there are clear signs of danger, the response is immediate. The breakthrough came when other families joined the cause. The Swansons weren't the only family in Minnesota who had lost someone and felt that the initial law enforcement response had been inadequate. Other families shared their stories, adding weight to the argument that the law needed to change. One particularly powerful story came from the family of Dan Zamlin, a University of St. Thomas student who had gone missing in St. Paul in April 2008, just a month before Brandon. His parents, Sally and Dale, testified that the search for their son had also been delayed, and that precious time had been lost. Though Dan's case also remains unsolved, his parents became advocates for Brandon's law. Brandon's law moved through the Minnesota legislature in the spring of 2009. It passed the House of Representatives unanimously, 134-0. Not a single representative voted against it. That kind of unanimous support is rare in any legislative body, and it showed how compelling the Swansons' advocacy had been. The bill then moved to the state Senate, where it also passed with overwhelming support. On May 7, 2009, almost exactly 1 year after Brandon's disappearance, Governor Tim Pawlenty signed Brandon's law into effect in a ceremony attended by Brian and Annette Swanson and their daughter Jamine. The law officially became effective on July 1, 2009. The impact. Brandon's law has had a significant impact in Minnesota. It has ensured that missing persons reports are taken seriously from the start, that valuable time isn't lost while police wait to see if someone shows up on their own, and that families in crisis get the immediate response they deserve. But perhaps more importantly, Brandon's law has inspired similar legislation in other states. The concept that adults who go missing under suspicious or dangerous circumstances deserve the same urgent response as missing children has spread across the country. Minnesota's experience with Brandon's law has been positive. Despite initial concerns, law enforcement agencies haven't been overwhelmed with false reports. The law has actually helped clarify procedures and improve coordination between agencies. And in several cases, the immediate response mandated by Brandon's law has likely saved lives. People have been found quickly who might have died if the search had been delayed. For Brian and Annette Swanson, the passage of Brandon's law was bittersweet. They were proud to have created something positive from their tragedy, proud to know that other families would benefit from the change they'd fought for. But it didn't bring Brandon home. It didn't answer the questions about what happened to their son. In interviews over the years, the Swansons have maintained their composure and dignity, even as they've described the emotional toll of Brandon's disappearance. The holidays are particularly difficult. Birthdays, Christmas, New Year's, all the times when the absence is most keenly felt. Brandon would be in his mid-30s now. He might have had a career in renewable energy, might have had a family of his own. Instead, he remains forever 19, frozen in time on that spring night when he walked into the darkness and never returned. The most widely accepted theory, and the one that law enforcement has generally favored, is that Brandon accidentally fell into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. This theory is supported by several pieces of evidence. The search dogs tracked Brandon's scent to the river. The scent trail appeared to cross the river and then ended abruptly on the other side. Brandon's last words, "Oh shit," could have been him realizing he was falling. The river was running high and fast in mid-May, making it dangerous. Someone walking through dark farmland could easily miss seeing a river until they were right at the edge. The theory would explain why Brandon suddenly went silent. If he fell into cold, fast-moving water, he would have been swept away quickly, potentially hitting his head or becoming disoriented. He might not have been able to cry out or continue the phone call. However, there are significant problems with this theory. No body has ever been found, despite extensive searches of the river. Bodies that drown in rivers typically surface within days or weeks as decomposition gases build up. It's been over 16 years now, and the Yellow Medicine River has been thoroughly searched multiple times. Brandon's phone stayed on for 2 days after his disappearance, which seems unlikely if it had been submerged. The water level wasn't dangerously high. Parts of the river were knee-deep, and while deeper sections existed, Brandon should have been able to notice he was approaching water. Some search experts have noted that if Brandon had drowned in the river, his body would almost certainly have been found by now, either in the river itself or washed downriver into the Minnesota River, which the Yellow Medicine flows into. Theory 2. Disorientation and hypothermia. Another possibility is that Brandon became disoriented, possibly due to alcohol consumption, though friends said he wasn't drunk, and succumbed to hypothermia while wandering through the fields. In mid-May in Minnesota, nighttime temperatures can drop into the 40s Fahrenheit. While that's not dangerously cold for someone dressed appropriately and moving around, it can become a problem if someone is wet from crossing water, exhausted from walking for miles, and possibly in shock from a fall or injury. Brandon was wearing a white t-shirt, a blue striped polo sweatshirt, a black zip-up jacket with a hood, baggy blue jeans, white sneakers. This is reasonably warm clothing for a Minnesota spring night, but if he got wet crossing streams or ditches, hypothermia could have set in. The theory suggests that Brandon might have become increasingly confused and disoriented, possibly removed some of clothing, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing that can occur in late-stage hypothermia, and eventually collapsed in a field where his body became concealed. However, this theory also has problems. Brandon was on the phone with his father and sounded coherent for 47 minutes. He wasn't exhibiting signs of confusion or disorientation during the call. Extensive searches of the area have found nothing. Even if his body had been initially hidden by crops, the seasonal searches should have found remains by now. Theory 3. Animal attack. Some have theorized that Brandon might have encountered an animal, possibly bear, though black bears are rare in that part of Minnesota, or perhaps aggressive farm animals like bulls. "Oh, shit!" could have been his reaction to suddenly encountering an animal. The sudden silence could indicate an attack that incapacitated him immediately. However, this theory is considered unlikely. There have been no documented black bear attacks in that area of Minnesota. Farm animals are generally confined and wouldn't be loose in fields at night. Even if an animal attack occurred, there would be physical evidence: blood, torn clothing, disturbed ground. An animal attack severe enough to immediately silence Brandon would have left substantial evidence that searchers should have found. Theory 4. Foul play. The most disturbing theory is that Brandon encountered someone with malicious intent during his walk. This could explain the sudden "oh, shit" as he realized he was in danger, the immediate silence that followed. Why no body has been found if someone deliberately concealed it? Why his phone stayed on for 2 days if someone else had it? Proponents of this theory point out several concerning facts. Brandon told his father he could see lights that he thought were from the town of Lind. What if those weren't town lights at all, but lights from a farmhouse or vehicle? What if someone saw Brandon walking alone in the dark and decided to harm him? Rural areas can attract criminals precisely because they're isolated and poorly monitored. However, there are problems with this theory too. There were no reports of suspicious vehicles or individuals in the area that night. No similar crimes occurred in that region before or after. If someone harmed Brandon, they managed to leave absolutely no evidence despite intensive searches. Brandon was on the phone with his father. If someone approached him, wouldn't he have said something? "There's someone here," or "a car is stopping." Some versions of this theory suggest that Brandon might have accidentally stumbled upon something illegal, perhaps a drug operation or illegal activity on farmland, and was killed to prevent him from reporting it. But this seems far-fetched and unsupported by any evidence. Theory 5. Voluntary disappearance. Some have suggested that Brandon chose to disappear, that he staged the accident and phone call, then voluntarily walked away from his life. This theory doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Brandon had everything to live for. He just finished his certificate program, had plans to transfer to Iowa Western in the fall, had a close relationship with his family. There's no evidence of any problems that would make him want to disappear. No financial troubles, no legal issues, no relationship drama. His family and friends were unanimous in saying this was completely out of character. If he wanted to disappear, why call his parents for help? Why stay on the phone with his father for 47 minutes? There have been no confirmed sightings of Brandon anywhere in the 16 years since he disappeared. He hasn't accessed any bank accounts, applied for jobs, or left any digital footprint. Most investigators dismiss this theory entirely. One theory that gained some traction is that Brandon might have fallen into an old well, cistern, or abandoned mine shaft that wasn't visible in the dark. Rural farmland in Minnesota does contain some old structures that could be hazardous. Abandoned wells from old farmsteads, cisterns or underground storage, drainage systems, old livestock pits. The theory suggests that Brandon could have stepped onto what looked like solid ground and fallen into a concealed opening. This would explain the sudden "oh shit" as he began to fall, the immediate end to the call, why his body has never been found if it's deep underground, why search dogs lost the scent if he fell into an enclosed space. Search teams have tried to identify and search any such structures in the area, but given the vast amount of farmland and the passage of time, it's possible some structures have been overlooked or have become so overgrown as to be unrecognizable. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case is how wrong Brandon was about his location. He thought he was near Lind, but he was actually near Porter, 25 miles away in a completely different direction. Several explanations have been proposed. The party theory. Some believe Brandon went to a third party that night that he didn't tell his parents about, perhaps one closer to Porter. This would explain why he was so far from where he was supposed to be. The wrong turn theory. Brandon might have gotten turned around on the dark rural roads, making a wrong turn that sent him in completely the wrong direction without realizing it. The GPS theory. Some have noted that the lights Brandon saw and thought were from Lind might have been from Porter instead, or from some other small town. In flat, dark farmland, it can be difficult to judge distances and directions, especially without landmarks. The alcohol theory. While his friends said he wasn't drunk, even mild intoxication can affect judgment and spatial awareness. Brandon might have been more impaired than he realized, leading to the navigation errors. As of 2024, Brandon Swanson's disappearance remains an active missing persons case with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. The case has never been officially closed, and investigators continue to follow up on any new leads that come in. However, the reality is that without new evidence or information, there's little investigators can do. The area has been thoroughly searched. Every credible tip has been investigated. Technology has advanced, ground-penetrating radar, drone surveillance, advanced DNA analysis, but none of these tools has produced results without evidence to analyze or specific locations to search. The BCA maintains that they would welcome any new information about Brandon's disappearance. They've emphasized that even small details that might seem insignificant could be important. Brian and Annette Swanson have never given up hope of finding their son, or at least finding answers about what happened to him. While the intensity of the organized searches has decreased over the years, the family continues to coordinate occasional search efforts, particularly when new technology becomes available or when tips come in suggesting specific areas to investigate. They've maintained a Facebook page dedicated to finding Brandon, where they share updates and keep his case in the public eye. They've participated in numerous interviews, podcasts, and documentary features, always with the same goal: keeping Brandon's story alive and hoping that someone, somewhere, knows something that could solve the mystery. In interviews, the Swansons have spoken movingly about what it's like to live with unresolved grief. Annette has described the difficulty of Mother's Day, of birthdays, of all the milestones that Brandon will never reach. Brian has talked about the constant what-ifs. What if they'd found him that night? What if the police had started searching immediately? What if Brandon had just stayed with the car instead of walking? But they've also spoken about the importance of hope. They refuse to assume the worst. They continue to believe that someday, somehow, they'll get answers. Media coverage and public interest. Brandon's case has been featured on numerous true crime platforms. Disappeared, Investigation Discovery, multiple true crime podcasts, YouTube channels dedicated to missing persons cases, various news documentaries, true crime books about unsolved disappearances. This media attention has kept the case in the public consciousness and has generated tips over the years, though none have led to a breakthrough. The case resonates with people because of its mysterious nature, the complete lack of explanation for what happened. In most missing persons cases, there are clues, patterns, some indication of what occurred. Brandon's case has none of that. It's as if he stepped through a doorway into another dimension and simply ceased to exist. Similar cases and patterns. Some researchers have noted similarities between Brandon's case and other mysterious disappearances in the upper Midwest. Young men disappearing near bodies of water. Cases involving disorientation and confusion. Phone calls that end abruptly. Extensive searches that find nothing. However, most law enforcement officials and serious investigators dismiss any connection between these cases. Each disappearance has its own unique circumstances, and similarities are likely coincidental rather than indicative of a pattern or serial predator. The impact on Marshall. In Marshall, Minnesota, Brandon's disappearance has left a lasting mark on the community. For those who knew him, there's a constant reminder of his absence. For younger residents who've grown up hearing his story, it's become a cautionary tale about the dangers that can exist even in familiar, seemingly safe places. The case has made people more aware of the importance of letting others know where you are, of staying on main roads when possible, of the real dangers that can exist in rural areas at night. Local schools have used Brandon's story in safety programs, emphasizing to students the importance of making smart choices and staying connected with family when traveling. It's now been over 16 years since Brandon Swanson said, "Oh, shit," and disappeared into the Minnesota night. 16 years of searching, wondering, hoping, and grieving. His younger sister Jamine has grown up without her older brother. She was just a child when he disappeared. Now she's an adult who's lived more of her life without Brandon than with him. His parents have aged under the weight of not knowing. But they've also shown remarkable strength, turning their private tragedy into public advocacy that has helped countless other families. Brandon himself, if he's still alive somewhere, and his parents have never completely given up that hope, would be in his mid-30s now. He would have finished his education, likely built a career in renewable energy as he planned. He might have had a family of his own. Instead, he remains frozen in time, forever 19, forever walking through that dark field, forever saying those last two words. The questions that remain. What happened to Brandon Swanson? Where is he? Is he somewhere in those fields, missed by countless searchers, waiting to be found? Did he fall into water and get swept away to a place where his body became trapped or buried? Did something more sinister occur? These questions have no answers. Not yet, maybe not ever. But what we do know is this. Brandon Swanson was a real person, loved by his family, valued by his community, with dreams and plans and a future that was stolen from him on a spring night in 2008. We know that his disappearance led to positive change. Brandon's law has helped other families avoid the delays and dismissiveness that the Swansons experienced. We know that his family has never stopped loving him, never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. And we know that somewhere out there might be answers. Someone might know something. Some piece of evidence might still be waiting to be discovered. Final thoughts. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Brandon walking through those dark fields, talking to his father, trying to find his way home. Think about a family that has lived in limbo for 16 years. Think about the mysteries that exist all around us, the questions that remain unanswered, the people who vanish without explanation. If you know anything at all, about Brandon Swanson's disappearance, please contact the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Even the smallest detail might be the key that finally solves this mystery. And if you're ever driving on rural roads late at night, if you ever find yourself stuck or lost or in need of help, remember Brandon's story. Stay with your vehicle if you can. Keep your phone charged. Let people know where you are. And most importantly, know that you are loved, that people are waiting for you to come home safely, and that your life matters. Brandon Swanson's story doesn't have an ending yet. But perhaps someday, with luck and persistence and maybe a little bit of hope, it will. Sleep well, everyone. And if you have loved ones, maybe tell them you love them tomorrow. You never know when a routine night might become the night someone doesn't come home. Rest in peace or rest wherever you are, Brandon. Your family hasn't forgotten you, and neither have we.